Alright. Alright, we'll try this again. If it doesn't work this time, fuck it. Alright. Spooky.
I grew up in a small town in North Carolina, a place called Bakersville. It's only about 16 miles from the Tennessee state line, and beyond that lies the fabled Appalachian Trail. I never really considered it until I moved elsewhere, but there's a certain spirit to Appalachia, especially the lower half where the trail extends up into the Great Smokies and the Pisgah National Forest. Bakersville is about 20 miles north of Pisgah, right in the center of the triangle where the three forests converge. And I don't know if there's something in the trees or the hills or the water, but it gets into the people, for better and for worse.
I wonder if we go.
For example,
like this.
Appalachians are just about the most superstitious people
Just have
I
the
have
sound
ever come
going.
across. Just about every culture has its little idiosyncrasies like that. You've probably heard someone say, knock on wood, to prevent something bad from happening, or perhaps they suggested that a black cat crossing your path is an omen of misfortune. Some people are told never to walk under ladders or that stepping on a crack will doom their mother to a broken back. But of all the people I've met on my travels, Appalachians win the prize for their bizarre superstitions. For instance, my grandmother, God rest her soul, said she never trusted anyone with a dimple on their chin.
The fuck?
She always used to say, dimples are made by the devil's shoe. And it wasn't just some silly saying to her either.
Fuck?
She was deadly serious in her belief that people with chin dimples were essentially cursed. She also thought that if your chickens laid eggs in odd numbers, it meant misfortune was on the way, and that you should never, ever wash your clothes on a Sunday. She had a ton of other crazy rules like that, and like I said, it was no joke. She really did believe that if she did a certain thing, like wearing a buckeye in her bra to ward off rheumatism, it would achieve the desired effect. And she also believed in the power of bad luck and black magic with all her heart and soul.
Weird.
I guess we're just much more prone to believing in things like that down here in lower Appalachia. Things of an otherworldly or fantastical nature. And that's why I believe my friend Scoot wholeheartedly when he said that there was a witch living up near Rattlesnake Ridge. I didn't believe him when he first told me, but he said that his cousin swore on his eyes that there was a witch living out there in a one-room shack, and that she put a curse on 4 men just after the war, who'd all ended up dying in mysterious circumstances.
I believe so.
But not only that, but thanks to his cousin, he knew exactly where this witch's shack was located, on the south side of Rattlesnake Ridge. Naturally, I demanded that he take me to it at the first available opportunity, to prove he and his cousin weren't a pair of no-good rotten liars. But to my surprise, he indignantly promised to do just that. We were both 12 and 13 years old at the time, so we were capable of finding our way back after a lengthy sojourn in the woods, and aware enough for me to want to show Scoot what a long-tongued liar his cousin was. So, one Saturday we set off in the early afternoon, bound for Rattlesnake Ridge. I understand that probably sounds like far too dangerous a trip for a couple of boys in their early teens, but you grow up in rural North Carolina and you learn how to walk in the woods. I feel like there are stereotypes of the southern outdoorsman or Midwest mountain man, treading softly through the woods like a cross between a Choctaw and a ninja. But that's just not accurate at all. Any woodsman worth his salt treads heavy through the woods. Snakes pick up on vibrations, and the handy thing about rattlers is they let you know that they're there if they don't hear you coming and get out of the way first. Anyway, that's just to give you a little background on why our parents were okay with us hiking out to a place named after a venomous snake. From our neighborhood, the walk out to the ridge took about an hour at a casual pace, until finally we see the tree-covered ridge rising up before us like some great sleeping giant. Scoot's cousin had said the witch's shack was on the southeastern side on the ridge, and that we'd smell the smoke of her fireplace before we ever saw her. This was the same fireplace where she supposedly cooked the butchered bodies of the children she captured before turning their bones into magical charms. I thought we'd spend an hour or two just wandering around, not being able to see or smell anything, before Scoot finally accepted that his cousin was full of crap. But then suddenly, we started to detect something that smells a lot like a campfire, or perhaps even the smoke billowing from the chimney of a witch's cottage. Scoot just about pops a gasket telling me, I told you he wasn't lying, in reference to his older cousin, and honestly, I'd be a liar if I said that it didn't send a shiver running through me. I just remember standing there, slack-jawed, having gone from not believing in him to not wanting to believe him. It was creepy, all right. But it was creepy in the way that a Boy Scout's campfire ghost story is creepy. Smelling that smoke in the way that we did, it had a kind of perfect timing to it. Like when the innocent high school couple discover the hook that's still buried in their car door, or when the babysitter learns that the call was coming from inside the house. It sent a shiver down my spine, and it couldn't have been real. There was no such thing as witches, and smelling campfire smoke was evidence of a campfire and nothing more. Once I realized that, I felt foolish. Scoot's cousin was lying, and feeling foolish only made me more determined to prove it. Plus, it was a fine opportunity to prove how brave I was to Scoot by marching off into the woods in search of the smoke's source. He thought I was straight up crazy, saying that we'd had to get out there and that I must have some kind of death wish to go looking for that witch. After all, she'd already killed 4 men by putting curses on them, so there's no telling what she'd do to 2 kids who deliberately set off to go treading round her holler. I knew that whoever was out there probably wouldn't react kindly to strangers, but I also knew that there wasn't any such damn thing as witches. So I didn't exactly go running off through the woods, but I kept on going with Scoot behind me, keeping an eye out for where the smoke was coming from. Then, about 200 yards in, we see this thicket of myrtle trees, the real dense kind with the wavy leaves, and behind them is what looked to be an old log cabin, one with a big old stone chimney affixed to the side of it. And Scoot says, "You believe me now?" And I'll admit, the evidence was mounting in his favor. But until we saw black cats and flying broomsticks, I wasn't buying a word of it. And I wasn't about to go all that way, only to turn back now that we'd found what we were looking for. And so for anyone who doesn't know wax myrtles, they sprout fairly close to the ground, meaning you gotta duck down low, under all the leaves and branches if you want to traverse a patch of them. There was also the occasional dogwood in there too, meaning that we had to weave in and out to get to where we could see the log cabin in all its shabby ingloriousness. But when we did finally lay eyes on that cabin, it looked exactly like you might expect a witch's shack to look. There was a broomstick right there near the little entrance with all kinds of dried herbs, wind chimes, and charm-looking things hanging on either side of the door. Scoot just about had a fit when he saw the broomstick, and I have to admit, I was starting to actually believe it myself at that point.
Fuck out of here.
But then right as we're starting to get really and truly frightened, the door to the shack swings open, and out steps the witch of Rattlesnake Ridge. Her hair was white and patchy, and she walked with a bit of a stoop, and I swear that she'd had a wart or 2 on her nose and chin. I was just about ready to pee my pants with fear at the sight of her, cursing myself for not believing Scoot and his cousin, but at least I stayed quiet. Scoot, on the other hand, he blurts out in a shaky voice, "There she is!" which the witch then hears and spins around to squint in our direction. She starts crowing, "Who's there? Y'all better show yourselves."
This is terrible.
But by that point, me and Scoot are bolting like startled foals, deaf, dumb, and blind to anything and everything except getting the hell away from Rattlesnake Ridge, and the witch we should have known better than to go looking for. We were terrified, absolutely beside ourselves with fear. We were convinced the witch was going to put a curse on us for having trespassed on her patch, and that it was only a matter of time before we too ended up dead under mysterious circumstances. We agreed to each head home to our parents to ask what they could do for us, how maybe the cops might be able to head out there and convince the witch to take back her curse. But whatever we did, we had to do it fast. So after issuing each other what we'd hoped would be not our final goodbye, we each headed home to beg our parents for help. I remember holding back tears until I got to my parents' house, but then the second I walked through the door and my mom asked me why I looked so terrible, I broke down and told her everything. How I hadn't believed Scoot and his cousin about the witch up on the ridge, how we'd trespassed on her property, and how we were now probably cursed to each suffer an untimely death. All the commotion brought my dad in from the garage, and he and my mother listened to the whole story before finally issuing their assurances. They told me that there was no such thing as witches, but that there was indeed an old woman living up near that ridge. She'd been living there for quite some time, and all she wanted was to be left alone, and that's why she'd gotten angry when she'd heard us in the bushes. She couldn't put any curses on us. We weren't going to die, but it was not a good idea to go wandering off into the woods like that for any reason, especially when that reason was to go bother some old little lady. And once I was safely reassured that the lady that we saw was most certainly not a witch, I started to calm down a little. But it didn't explain why a woman lived out in the woods, all on her own like that, and when I asked, I was essentially told that it was complicated, but that she wanted to live out there on her own. It wasn't like the people in town were mean to her or anything like that. And after that, my mom called Scoot's mom, and they talked it out to make sure everyone was on the same page. Scoot's parents were nice folks, so they told him basically the same thing as I was told. We didn't have to be scared of that old lady, but we weren't to go snooping around her property anymore. And Scoot and I were then allowed to talk on the phone, and we went from crying to laughing in the space of a few minutes. It was just pure relief, I think. That and how funny it was that we ran full sprint from a woman whose top speed was probably a mile or two an hour. We just kind of moved on after that.
Fucking savage.
I remember thinking of that woman every so often, but I wasn't afraid of her. I just thought that she was kind of weird, living all alone in the woods like that. I didn't feel sorry for her. I mean, she chose to live out there. And I didn't know why, but I didn't care to know either. She was just the crazy cat lady who lived out in the woods, and just like everyone else in town, that fact grew as normal to me as just about any other thing. I guess a lot of other kids asked their parents the same thing. Scoot's cousin talked about the witch, and so did we when we returned to school that Monday. We were telling people how we'd been out there, and how she wasn't really a witch, and then we laughed off everyone who swore blind that she was, and that we were doomed to die any day from the curse that she put on us. The other kids had heard about those 4 men she supposedly cursed to die, but we knew better. We'd had grown-ups to tell us the not-so-scary truth, so we weren't afraid at all. And that pretty much settled the argument, as a bunch of other kids mentioned how their parents had told them the truth too. She was just a sad, weird old lady, and those 4 men's deaths had nothing to do with her. But as I came to learn, that wasn't strictly the truth. The first part of this story, as in mine and Scoot's little encounter with the witch, that took place back in the mid-70s, a long time ago. And I remember it was around late April of 1975 because the TV had pictures of Vietnam on it almost non-stop. Things were turning real bad for the folks on the ground, and I remember my dad watching reels of helicopters lifting people off of rooftops in Saigon. And the next part, which doesn't really involve the witch at all, took place in 2004, when myself and Scoot were home in Bakersville visiting family. Now, there was nowhere to drink alcohol around Bakersville, so we had to catch a ride over to Burnsville, 10 miles south, so we could get drunk there before my sister drove over to pick us up come closing time. I hadn't seen Scoot in maybe 2 years at that point, and since the Panthers were playing that night, I wanted to whoop his ass at pool, and I thought that we'd take things over to a little bar down there so we could really make a meal of things. But anyway, we headed down there. The Panthers lose their game, but I win at pool, so that just about evened things out. It was a weeknight too, so the place was pretty empty during the last hour of service. Just a few patrons in a few of the booths, then myself, Scoot, and this older-looking guy finishing our beers at the bar. Scoot and I are deep in reminiscing by that point, and we're talking about this and that until eventually the subject of the Witch of Rattlesnake Ridge comes up. And we start laughing to ourselves, cursing his cousin for having us scare the bejesus out of ourselves like that. But then, with years of hindsight under our belts, we start kind of ruminating on why the witch was living out there in the first place. I'm sure she wouldn't mind us calling her that either. The reputation sure did keep folks from prying into her affairs too much. But it did strike me as odd that I'd never taken the time to really find out why she was out there. But also, who were those 4 men who supposedly had died, and why did people blame their deaths on our wicked witch's curse? We started speculating, very casually too, I do recall. I didn't think that she'd be around anymore. She was ancient back when we were kids, so we both agreed that she probably wasn't around almost 30 years later, unless she really was a witch. Anyway, we're talking about her back and forth when suddenly, the older guy sitting down from us at the bar asked the bartender for one more for him, and one more for each of the 2 fellas he's about to tell a very long and eerie tale to. And then he invites us down to the stools to sit next to him and introduces himself as a former resident of our hometown, Bakersville.
Yo.
We introduce ourselves,
Tell me he's heard of
thank him for the beer, and then ask him what sort of eerie tale that he has to tell us, as we both kind of laugh. I should have known that it concerned the witch, and I guess I was a little slow on the uptake on account of the beers, but when he told us that he knew why the Witch of Rattlesnake Ridge chose to live where she did, and what's more, he knew why people linked those men's deaths to her, my interest was piqued. The old-timer told us that if this was 30 or 40 years ago, he'd never have dreamed of telling us the truth. But since everyone involved was surely past by this point, the witch included, there wasn't any reason why we shouldn't know the truth, especially if we'd once seen her with our very own eyes. And foolishly, I started poking fun at the guy, probably due to all the beers again. It wasn't that he'd offered to tell us, nor was it that he did so in such a dramatic way. It's that he tried to tell us that the witch and the deaths of those 4 men I mentioned really were linked in some way. I started asking if she turned them into frogs or flew out on her broomstick to claim their souls on the night of the full moon. But the guy shook his head, evidently not appreciating my attempts at humor. He told us the men's death had nothing supernatural about them, but they were very much connected to both the witch and the reason she chose to live out there alone.
I'm so good.
He reiterated that if folks involved were still alive, there's no way in hell that he'd be telling the whole tale to a little brat like me, in his words. So I didn't want to listen, and I could just take my beer and go jump in a goddamn lake, his words again. If I did want to listen, I could sit my ass down and find out why at least one of those men's deaths simply had to be connected to the witch, because one of the men had been her own goddamn husband. I then realized how terribly I'd misjudged this whole situation. In all my years, I never once heard anyone mention how one of the witch's so-called victims had been her own husband. The fact this guy knew that and was willing to tell us, that gave him this whole level of legitimacy. And so I sat my ass down and listened to what he had to tell us. The witch's name was Dora Ann Quinlan, and back in 1941, she got married to a man named James Cranwell. Their marriage was a happy one, at first anyway, and then the Japanese bombed Pearl Harbor and the whole world changed overnight for them. Cranwell was called up into the army, and then was sent off to fight the Germans in North Africa. And then at some point during his service, he was declared missing in action. A few months later, Dora Ann gets news that a whole bunch of American bodies had been found. Germans had taken him prisoner, then instead of taking them off to some camp, those Nazi bastards massacred them, piled up their bodies, and then set them on fire. Some of James's stuff was found among the charred remains, so it was assumed that he'd been among those executed by the Germans.
Sure.
She got the news in the late of summer of 42, and Dora Ann was devastated. She wore black for months, but by Christmas of 43, she was said to be getting cozy with a grocery store clerk who had been declared unfit for service. I don't think that you could find a single person who judged Dora Ann harshly for wanting to find happiness again, but all the same, she didn't want to sully the memory of her marriage to her late husband, so she opted to conduct the affair in secret.
Oh.
And that worked for them all throughout the early 44, but by the holidays of that same year, the affair was something of an open secret. Yet naturally, almost no one thought any less of Dora Ann for wanting to rekindle a little romance in her life, and so folks kind of just played dumb while silently hoping for some kind of marriage proposal. But then, in early 46, right when everybody is expecting Dora Ann and the clerk to tie the knot, she gets a telegram from the army with news that shook her world just as much as when those Japanese torpedoes sunk the Arizona. Her husband, James Arthur Cranwell, was alive. Cranwell had been a prisoner at one of those last camps to be liberated during the Allied march through Germany, and when he'd been found, he was on death's door. When he left the States, James was around 180 pounds, give or take, but by the time they got him back to the American Field Hospital, he didn't weigh an ounce over 95 pounds. Skeletal, they called him. But over the months that followed his rescue, he put on some weight, learned to walk again, and the first thing he asked was for his wife to be contacted so she learned of his survival. A few days later, Dora Ann gets her telegram, and she and her clerk know that their relationship is doomed.
Yeah.
James comes home and the whole town welcomes him back as a hero, Dora included. But there's just one big problem. She doesn't want to end her relationship with the clerk, which results in them making a serious error of judgment. And one night, after a session of heavy drinking with his old high school buddies, James Cranwell comes home to find his wife in bed with that grocery store clerk.
No.
What happened next is something that almost doesn't bear repeating, so I'll try to put it in as implicit a manner as possible. Cranwell was furious. He beat the clerk to a pulp, tied him to the bed frame with his belt, and then set about teaching Dora Ann a lesson. But that wasn't enough. When his buddies tried to leave, Cranwell insisted they stay and watch. Then when he was done, he demanded that they teach Dora Ann a lesson too. And they beat the hell out of that girl, and then took turns having their way with her.
Yo, what the
Then, when it was all said and done, the clerk, who had been forced to watch the entire thing from just a few feet away, was dragged into the woods outside of town, and then shot in the head. Cranwell and his buddies then did something to hide the body. Nobody knows what, because they never found it, but Dora Ann knew that they killed the clerk, and she told the town sheriff that much when he asked her about it. Cranwell kept Dora locked up for a few days, and then he kicked her out of the house barefoot, wearing nothing but a dirty dress. She walked into town, then went straight to the sheriff's office to tell him everything. The sheriff then goes over to talk to Cranwell, but he denies the whole thing. Yes, it was true that he'd come home to find his wife in bed with another man, after she'd falsely believed him to be staying out all night. And sure, he might have slapped the guy around a little before kicking him out, but he hadn't killed him. He'd threatened to if he ever saw him again, but he hadn't murdered him. No, the clerk had gone missing due to the shame of what he'd done, and if he did so happen to show back up in town, Cranwell claimed that he was happy to let bygones be bygones. After all, coming home drunk like that, thinking that he might have been assaulting poor Dora Ann in their marriage bed, Cranwell said the clerk was lucky to be alive, and reluctantly, the sheriff agreed. The thing was, if he had a shred of evidence that Cranwell killed the clerk, or if he could prove beyond all doubt that all the stuff Dora Ann said was true, he'd be happy to bring a case against Cranwell and his buddies. But aside from Dora Ann, who at this point was not looked on favorably thanks to her decision to continue the affair, the sheriff had no witnesses, no evidence, and therefore no case.
Can't blame her. Come on now.
But that didn't sit well with the Bakersville townsfolk. From their perspective, all they noticed at first was that the clerk was missing, and it took days before Dora Ann limped into town to give an account to the sheriff and his deputies. After that, word of the incident spread like wildfire, and although everyone agreed that Dora Ann and her beau should have ended the affair, no one thought it warranted a death sentence, and what Cranwell and his buddies did to Dora Ann was nothing short of unforgivable. Certain figures approached the town sheriff and begged him to do something about it. The sheriff then ordered corpse hounds to go sniffing around the Cranwell place, and they picked up the scent of a body that had been moved sometime in the past week or so. This on its own was incriminating, but the deputies couldn't actually find any corpse, as the trail just sort of petered out somewhere in the woods near Rattlesnake Ridge. Sure, someone else might have killed the clerk, and maybe they did it on his property, Cranwell claimed, but it sure as hell wasn't him. And his soon-to-be ex-wife was welcome to press charges if she wanted to, but she didn't. Instead, Dora Ann went to live with her parents and spent the foreseeable future tucked into her old childhood bedroom, lingering in a very deep depression. It was an incredibly sad and incredibly horrible situation, but the people of Bakersville weren't about to let such an atrocity slide. Months went by, and with each passing day, those who murdered the clerk became more and more convinced that they'd gotten away with their crimes. But then one night, Bakersville settled down to sleep without a care in the world, and then the next morning, residents awoke to find the town crawling with state patrol officers. During the night, not only had Cranwell's house gone up in flames, presumably with James Arthur having been burned to a crisp, but his two old high school buddies had also suffered mysterious and horrifying accidents. One had driven off the road on a clear stretch of highway, then struck a tree at what had to be at least 50 miles an hour.
Damn.
The other had drunk an entire bottle of bad whiskey and had been slowly poisoned while in a state of unconsciousness. The three suspicious deaths had caused quite a racket on law enforcement channels, and with the local fire and sheriff's departments overwhelmed with the various scenes, the state patrol had been called in. They visited every home in town, asking everyone the same two questions. Did you see anything? And did you hear anything?
No.
To both questions, everyone gave the same two replies, no and no. Somehow, 3 men had died without anyone in town having the slightest idea of how they'd lost their lives. To the townspeople, it was a freak accident, and the fact that all 3 men had died within hours of one another and all happened to be involved in the disappearance of the clerk, well, that was just all one big coincidence now, wasn't it? Just like it had been a mere coincidence that someone had been murdered on James Cranwell's property on the very same night the clerk had gone missing. Only one of the deaths were ever proven to be murder, as the state patrol proved the fire at Cranwell's house was caused by arson. But as for his 2 buddies, well, both their deaths appeared to be nothing more than tragic accidents. When news of their deaths reached Dora Ann, she was said to have smiled for the first time in months. She started eating properly again, started to sleep properly again, and after a while she started taking long walks in the woods. She'd walk out on her own most days, leaving just after sunrise and coming home just before dark, and she'd spend every trip wandering around the last place those corpse hounds picked up the scent of what everyone believed was the clerk's dead body at Rattlesnake Ridge. She was looking for the body, and she carried on looking for it for years and years until one day, Dora Ann stopped coming home again. People thought that she might have offed herself out there.
No.
Others thought that she picked up a rattlesnake bite or had a run-in with an overly protective mama bear. But then sometime later, I guess someone must have found her cabin out there, either newly built or haphazardly refurnished, and then word spread that she was still alive. I guess the men's death must have stayed in people's minds for a while back then, enough to get their kids and grandkids talking about it. And that's when I figured the rumors of witchcraft first started, to get some over-curious kids to shut their damn mouth.
Yeah.
The less people talked about it, the better, and if kids did insist on talking about it, then the next best thing was to shroud the truth in myth and legend. I guess Dora Ann figured that she'd be better positioned to find her old lover's body if she resided around its last known location. That way, she could spend the rest of her days trying to find it, while being pleasantly sequestered from a world that had so terribly let her down. And may she, and her long-departed lover, rest in peace. And many thanks to the old-timer in the bar that night who finally gave us the answers to the age-old mystery of the witch of Rattlesnake Ridge.
Okay, 1, that story sucked. 2, When I was growing up, I lived like really close to like woods and forests and stuff like that. And we always, at our school, there was like this big rumor that there was like this homeless guy living in the woods, and we're like, nah, no way, man. There's no fucking way. Because living in suburbs, it's like homeless people weren't really a thing at the time in like the 90s, at least in our area. Have you ever seen like the 1990s like Dennis the Menace movie where like the drifter comes into town? It was like that kind of thing. So yeah, all the kids would talk about this like homeless guy in the woods, and we're all like, nah, no, there's no way. And then one time I was out there playing in the woods with my sister and like a family friend and stuff like that. And we saw the freaking homeless guy. I shouldn't have used circle for this, oh my god. But anyways, we saw the homeless guy. And then when we went to the park that was just outside the woods, cops came like barreling in and like stopped just short of us when we were at the jungle gym and started like freaking out on us to get the hell out of the area and asking if we saw anyone. Scary. That was also how I saw my first porno magazine. Was finding that homeless guy's encampment later with my like buddy. Yeah. On to the next shitty story.
Many, many years ago now, an old friend of mine and I were hiking along a section of the Appalachian Trail in Tennessee. He had camping gear with us, along with a bunch of other survival stuff, but as much as we tried to pack as light as possible, day after day of almost non-stop hiking really started to take its toll on us. Plus, there was the unexpected factor of not being able to get any real sleep outdoors. We'd each done a little camping in the past, but we'd each done so way up in the Northeast, and we'd done so in a very controlled and safe environment. Sleeping in paper-thin tents out in Appalachia, however, was something else entirely. But then, on the afternoon of the fourth day of our journey, we ran into a solo hiker coming the opposite way up the trail, so we stopped and picked their brain on what the trail ahead of us had in store. And that's when he mentioned a shelter, a 2-story one that had camp beds on both the ground and first floor. He says it was only around 10 miles further down the trail, and if we got on the move again, we could be there by nightfall if we really beat feet. An enclosed shelter like that meant that we might be able to just get a full 8 hours of sleep, which at that stage would be a huge boost both physically and mentally. So after thanking the guy 1,000 times over, we got back on the trail immediately. Maybe 3 to 4 hours later, the shelter comes into view, and although it wasn't quite what we'd been expecting, it certainly beat setting up camp all over again. The wooden cabin-looking thing wasn't completely closed off, but it had these 2 raised sleeping platforms, one taller and one shorter. I guess that's what the guy meant by 2-story. We pictured a small cottage or something with a door and maybe a fireplace. But beggars most certainly can't be choosers, so we claimed one of the sleeping platforms by tossing our bags up onto it before unpacking our food supplies to make ourselves some dinner. Maybe an hour or 2 after we'd eaten, my friend and I are just chilling near the shelter when we suddenly see 2 other hikers making their way down the trail towards us. It was a guy and girl, and I figured they might have been a couple as we greeted them. They asked if both sleeping platforms had been claimed, and when we said no, the guy half of the couple asked if they could use it. We said sure, and that we'd try and be good bunkmates so we could all get some well-deserved rest without worrying about stuff crawling or slithering into our tents. Now, don't get it twisted, we each knew that we could seal our tents up and keep out the bugs, snakes, and bigger creatures. But just try sleeping in an airless piece of plastic during early Tennessee summers. You'll find you've created less of a sleeping space and more of a sauna. But anyway, we were very happy to find ourselves some shelter, but the couple, who did turn out to be a couple, were anything but. They got to bickering almost as soon as they put their gear down, meaning the vibe went from, oh cool, we got some company, to, well, this is awkward, faster than you can say trouble in paradise. They didn't have a stand-up fight or anything, but we could hear them whisper arguing up on the sleeping platform for a little while, and then they'd quit, but then start up again minutes later. The biggest break in the tension was when my buddy says something like, "Jesus, just break it up already," under his breath. I started laughing, and then the lady half of the couple confronted us asking, "What's so funny? What's so funny, huh?" We denied everything, insisted that we're laughing at something else, and the girl's boyfriend or fiance or whatever, he has to basically pull her away from us while explaining that we weren't laughing at them. I mean, we were, but there was no point turning a two-person argument into a four-person argument, and the atmosphere was bad enough as it was. So, like I said, the couple next to us are arguing on and off, pretty much all night, but they managed to cool it long enough for everyone to get some sleep. But then at some point in the middle of the night, my buddy and I wake up to the sound of them arguing again, only this time, it's quite a bit louder than it had been before. I couldn't make out exactly what they were arguing over. I just heard the odd word or two, like the girl hissing something like, "You never listen to me," or the guy saying something like, "It's too far, Sarah. We won't make it in time." And they kept at it like that, getting louder and louder. And then right when we were on the verge of telling them to keep it down so we could get some sleep, the girl raises her voice all the way up to like a low yell and says to the guy, "Oh yeah? Well, maybe that's exactly what I'll do." This is then followed by the sound of someone moving around on the sleeping platform next to and below us. The guy starts saying something like, "Don't do this," and then says the girl's name, but I don't want to repeat that here. I'd rather not drop the guy's name either, because in this context it feels like a little too much info to go throwing around online. And anyway, their argument gets a little louder, and we're just trying to figure out what the guy doesn't want the girl to do when all of a sudden she tosses her pack down off the sleeping platform, and then we hear the sound of her climbing down the ladder before she comes into view. The guy and the girl continue their cryptic argument for a minute or so, but one thing becomes obvious. The girl is about to walk off into the dark trail, armed with nothing but a flashlight, because for whatever reason she wants to continue their hike while I'm assuming her boyfriend wanted to rest the entire night. I get that she was mad at him or whatever, but hiking alone and at night, especially somewhere like the southern AT, is never, ever a good idea.
Nah.
My buddy calls out, "Excuse me, miss, I wouldn't do that if I were you." But she cuts him right off by yelling an expletive back in his direction. And we're both like, "Well, okay, suit yourself, lady," and shared a hushed, nervous little chuckle as the guy on the platform next to us called out to his girlfriend one last time. We then watched her walking off into the trees, watching as the beam of her flashlight got fainter and fainter until finally, when it was just on the verge of disappearing completely, my buddy kind of shimmies over to the edge of the platform and starts talking to the guy half of the couple. "You should go after her," I remember he said. But at first, that guy was like, "Hell no. If she wants to leave, she can leave." Recognizing that he was just mad and would 100% live to regret not going after her, we started insisting that he follow his girl. And then my buddy, probably trying to sort of galvanize him into action, says to the guy, "If you're too scared to go after her, fine. But I will." I figured it was probably the lack of sleep making him talk like that, and I was right about to tell him not to antagonize the guy when I hear from the other bunk, "The hell did you just say to me?" And my heart sinks, and I'm thinking my buddy is about to get into a fist fight with some complete stranger in the ass end of nowhere. Luckily, the guy doesn't climb down off of his sleeping platform, and he and my buddy just carry on talking trash to each other. I didn't want to really inflame the situation, but I couldn't help but agree that the guy should probably go after her, even if it was just to convince her to come back to the shelter. The discussion continued down this dumb, immature path for a minute or two, and I remember pulling myself out of my sleeping bag and getting ready to put my boots on. If my buddy and her boyfriend were content to bicker like children, then someone had to go be a grown adult and put their boots on and go tell that girl that a solo night hike sounded like the mother of all bad ideas. I tried once, and failed once, to get the two guys to shut up so I could announce my departure and request their assistance. And they kept at it for a few more seconds, And that's when we heard it. The scream that echoed through the pitch-black woods cut through their bickering like a hot knife through butter, and silenced the pair of them completely. Then, as we all just sat there, frozen in terror, we heard a second scream, and that one launched us into action. I threw up my boots, the other two guys did the same, and then after grabbing our flashlights, we started hustling down the trail in the direction of the screams. The girl's boyfriend was way ahead of us, and I don't know if he ran track in college or whatever, but he should have. That, or realizing his girl was in danger, gave him superhuman speed because he had us eating his dust to get to his girl in as fast as time as possible. The screams get louder and louder as we got closer and closer to her. Then, all of a sudden, there she is, lying just off the trail ahead of us, and right away I can see why she's screaming. One of the girl's legs was sitting at this weird, unnatural angle, clearly broken, but as we get to her and start trying to give her first aid, she starts yelling that he's here. He's still here, he has to be. One of us asks, "Who's here?" And then the girl replies, "The person who broke my leg." At first, we're obviously all thinking, okay, don't touch her, don't make the break any worse. But then the moment she said someone had attacked her, me and her boyfriend started scrambling to get her up, while my buddy starts shining his flashlight into the woods all around us, trying to spot whoever the girl was screaming about. Those were legitimately the most terrifying few minutes of my entire life. Someone was out there, someone who wanted to do us physical harm, and we could only move as fast as we could safely transport the girl with the broken leg. Every other second I was asking my buddy, "Do you see anyone?" And the whole time he's calling back, "I don't know, I can't tell," because he's having to cover like 360 degrees with just one flashlight. The girl was screaming right in my ear as I was supporting her left side too, so I was having to ask my buddy over and over just to be able to hear his replies, all while I'm expecting some psycho hillbilly to pop out from behind a tree at any moment before smashing me over the head with whatever he just broke that girl's leg with. Thankfully, we were able to get back to that shelter without running into anybody, and there we armed ourselves with our knives and hatchets and then set about giving the girl some first aid. And this is way back before cell phones, so there was no calling 911 or ranger station to get some help. We had to literally patrol our wooden shelter all night with our flashlights in hand, making sure no one was sneaking up on us, and that whole thing made for the second most terrifying thing I'd ever experienced. At least by that point, we were actually armed in some capacity, but like you're already probably thinking, the big fear was that someone with a gun was just going to use the beam of our flashlight as a target. If that happened, we'd be sitting ducks, fish in a barrel, and we wouldn't stand a chance. But if anyone did follow us back to the shelter that night, they chose not to show themselves, and we held out until dawn before getting to move on again. The other really creepy thing was, right after we got the girl back to the shelter and we started to give her first aid, we were obviously all very curious as to who or what attacked her. She kept saying how she didn't see the guy's face, but after the impact on her leg and her falling to the ground, she saw the back of the guy running away through the trees. She was 99% sure that it was a man, and he'd hit her leg with a stick or something blunt before running off. It was definitely some kind of stick or tool, she said, not a punch or a kick. Someone had waited for her, run up from the side, smashed something into the side of her knee so hard that it actually broke the leg. It was terrifying to think. If we hadn't had to run out there when we did, whoever broke the girl's leg would have probably come back for part 2. I figured he probably turned back for her, then saw all of our flashlights coming up the trail towards the screaming. And that's also what makes me think that it was just one, or maybe 2 guys at the most. Small numbers for us to be able to scare him off like that. Anyway, once dawn hit and we got some decent light, we made ourselves a makeshift little stretcher, rolled the girl onto it, and then carried her all the way into this little town called Hampton, where we were able to get her some medical attention. We were originally going to part ways there and then, but not before we swapped contact info so we could keep in touch to see how things went. But then, literally as we were walking away, we decided that we'd stay in town, help the guy, half of the couple, with all the stressful stuff that he had to deal with. You know, police reports and all that kind of stuff. and also get some decent rest in a hotel room if we could find one.
Fuck that.
And we also realized it would be very stupid to just walk back up onto the same trail as the attack had just taken place on, and to do so on no sleep would just be insanity. And the rest of the story is kind of boring, so I'll keep it short. We kept in touch with the couple to make sure that they were okay and to find out if the person who attacked the girl got caught. And no surprises for those who guessed that the cops had no clue where to even begin and were not very helpful at all. The girl's leg seemed to heal okay, though. We ended up finishing the rest of our hike after skipping ahead about 10 miles, just to be certain that we were well away from the site of that attack. Human-on-human encounters like that tend to be as rare as hen's teeth on a place like the Appalachian Trail. 99.9% of folks that you meet are fundamentally good, and I can attest to that myself. But it's not just the bears and snakes you gotta worry about out there. I learned that the hard way, and you can gather that I kept my survival knife on hand whenever I went to sleep for the whole rest of that Tennessee hiking trip.
Yeah, fuck that. That shit probably happens all the time.
Back during the summer between my sophomore and junior year in college, my study buddy and I, turned best friend for life, decided that we'd like to hike the Vermont section of the Appalachian Trail. It started off great. We'd hiked together a few times before, so we knew that we could tough out the rougher portions of the trail together. So by day 3, we were still in high spirits, and we were still looking forward to our final 2 days hike. But then, during the early afternoon of that first day, we saw something that made us cut our trip short by 2 whole days. We were walking along, praying to the trail gods to keep the rain away, when my friend suddenly stopped and pointed towards something in the trees off trail. It looked like a bright red piece of cloth of some kind, barely visible, but there it was, hanging from a tree branch about 20 to 30 yards off the trail. The both of us said something like, "Who the hell does that?" As in, who the hell just tosses their dirty clothes over a branch instead of carrying them home again, because that's honestly what we figured had happened. And so off we went, marching off in the direction of this random shirt, figuring that we could take it down and toss it in the trash once we got back to civilization. But the more visible the red cloth gets, the more we realize that it's not just been thrown there randomly. It's a marker for what lay underneath. Right there in the dirt, beneath what turned out to be a red shirt, were what looked like 2 empty graves. My friend and I just about freaked the heck out, mainly because there were 2 graves and 2 of us. We didn't bother grabbing the shirt. We just moved as quickly as we could down the rest of the Glastonbury section of the trail, and then turned down the road towards Bennington so we could report what we'd seen to the police. Some people have asked me why we just didn't call 911 from there on the trail, but honestly, there's not much that would have been achieved. Even if I had been able to get a connection, the most important thing to us in the moment was putting enough distance between us and those graves as possible. I get that we could have relayed our last position or something on the off chance that we were attacked by someone, but if that actually happened, we'd have been just as screwed, and calling 911 wouldn't have made a damn bit of difference if we needed to sprint down some section of trail away from some homicidal maniac. After we got to the nearest town, we found a phone and then called 911 to get connected with the local cops. I told them everything, and the cop I spoke to took the whole thing very seriously and then thanked me for calling it in. He also gave me his personal contact number in case I wanted to check in and see how things were progressing. I thought that was a very polite thing of him to do, trying to give me a little peace of mind and make me feel like I was being taken care of.
Yeah, sure.
But then it came to decide if we wanted to actually continue with the rest of our hike, and at first, we were at an impasse. My best friend was adamant that we could just skip ahead of the trail a little and maybe catch a ride into the next town over, then hop back onto the trail for the rest of our journey. I wanted to. I really did, and I wasn't using those graves as an excuse to cut the trip short, but I couldn't go walking back up into those hills in good conscience, knowing something that dark was going on in the area. The way I saw it, and this is what I said to my friend, those might not be the only 2 graves set up. There might be others all along this section of the trail, and someone just waits by them, waiting for either one or two hikers that he can murder and bury in less than an hour. And we agreed to stay in a motel that night, then we called the sheriff again the next day.
Oh, shit.
If some innocent explanation had been found for the graves, then we'd move on as planned. But if not, then I couldn't continue. I just couldn't. The next day, what do you know, the sheriff hasn't even gotten around to checking the graves out, but he assures me that he'll get around to it that same day.
Yeah,
I
sure.
thanked him, in as polite a manner as I could say, but the lack of action on his part just marked the end of our trip.
We'll skip that boss
My
round.
friend was pretty angry at the time because our hike along the Tennessee section of the Appalachian Trail was something she'd been looking forward to for a hell of a long time. But as I explained to her on the ride back home, over and over again, it was something that I'd been looking forward to as well. I didn't just throw in the towel because I heard a few spooky nighttime noises and wanted an actual shower. I quit because I was scared for my life. Having someone hang a few Blair Witch stick figures in the trees along the trail is one thing, an obvious prank or just a tribute to an objectively awesome
That shit would
movie.
be funny.
But two graves, marked out by a bright red shirt like that, someone put way too much time and effort into them for it to just be a prank. Or at least, it's not something I'm willing to bet my life on. A few years back,
Yeah, one more
a few
story.
friends
Yeah.
and I were hiking the Appalachian Trail not far from Allentown, Pennsylvania, when we found something that scared the crap out of us. We were taking a break at the small collection of rocks that sort of served as little chairs for us, when a friend of ours stood to stretch his legs a little and walked around his rock, and then noticed something sort of jutting out from the base. He reached down and pulled out what looked like an old-fashioned sort of tin of candy, the metal kind with the lid on a hinge. We start making jokes about how he's found someone's stash, but when he opens it, all he finds is these two dirty pieces of paper. He takes them out, sets that tin down on the rock, and then unfolds the first of the two pieces. He takes a look at one side and then turns it around to show us that it's just this sort of crude drawing of some rocks and some trees, presumably the same rocks and trees that we're at right now.
No.
But then, as he turns the piece of paper around to show us, he reads what's on the back of that paper, and his face just seems to drop. We ask what's wrong, and he reads the short message aloud. This was the last thing Sarah ever saw, he said.
Yo, fuck that.
And we all respond, what? No way, dude, show us. And he wasn't lying. It really did say that. But then I ask him to unfold the other piece of paper, but he refuses. So another one of my buddies gets up and walks over and takes the unfolded paper from him. And then after unfolding it and briefly taking a look at what was written, his expression drops as well. List of people I want to apologize to, he read aloud, and then went on to list a bunch of people that someone had apparently stolen from. My first thought was that it was maybe a note that someone leaves before they take their own life, written by someone who liked to draw and refer to themselves in the third person or something. But then hearing how they stole from someone, that made me think that it was written in the third person because it truly was written by someone else. This sparked a lot of debate between us because obviously theft didn't exclude the possibility of someone dying. And Sarah could have stolen a bunch of money, regretted it, and then walked up into the hills to take her own life.
True.
But then, surely a note like that would have included an apology to her parents or something. At least, that was my take on it. Why only list the people you stole from? It took a minute before one of us thought to compare the handwriting on each note, but even then, we weren't all decided. The apology note was 100% written with a different pen, but the handwriting was so shaky that it's not out of the question that it was written at a different time, when the writer was feeling extreme emotions and all that. In the end, we stopped arguing over it and decided to look around for any signs of a body or anything. There was no chance of us just sort of slipping the notes back into the tin, sliding it back under the rock, and just walking away after finding something like that. Even if it was just someone's idea of some sick joke, then it was worth our peace of mind to make sure that we weren't leaving someone rotting in the woods. And we walked around for a while, but didn't find any bodies. We didn't find anything suspicious or anything either, and if I'm being honest, I didn't even know what I was looking for.
A
I
body.
kept telling one of my buddies to watch out for disturbed earth, thinking there might have been a shallow grave under our feet. But then we were in the woods. All the earth is disturbed. And after that, we got to thinking on what we should do again, and we decided to take the box and the notes into the next town, and then drop them off at the precinct or the department of whatever kind of law enforcement-related place they had in town. And when we got there, we told the cops the same thing I just told you. It might be nothing, just a dumb joke or something, but we couldn't just walk off and forget that we ever found that tin and those notes. And to this day, it remains the creepiest thing I've ever come across while hiking.
That was terrible. You found a note. Like, okay. So, that was the definition of and what? Park Ranger horror stories. 3 hours. All right. We're gonna get out of this game because no, it's just not doing it. All right, switch to this game. Okay, we'll add this. Nah, you know what? Fuck it. We'll watch it.
Hello, friends.
I'm gonna pause it though. We're gonna have to lower that down. And then go down here. Any fucking minute now. Well, while this is doing that, I'll be back. up a little bit. Da, 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 da. Let's switch that. Let's go close. Alright.
About 70% of the friends who watch my videos are not subscribed, and I would be very happy if you did. Also, don't forget to press the like button and leave your comments. This appeared almost instantly.
Oh, I can't listen to that guy's voice for the whole thing. There ain't no way. There ain't no fucking way.
I grew up during the 70s in a little place called Vernon up in British Columbia. It's a nice enough place, I guess, good place to raise a family, but after scrapping my way through high school, I was faced with a sort of bleak future. I didn't really like the sound of working menial jobs around Vernon for the rest of my life, but at the same time, I didn't want to just pack up and leave. I liked Vernon. All of my friends and family were there, but most of the jobs available to me involved punching the clock for someone else. I knew I couldn't listen to some idiot hoser give me orders all day, and neither did I want to be a cop or a fireman or anything else that paid good money without a degree. All I wanted to do was work on motorcycles. Only thing was, I didn't have a motorcycle, nor did I have the money to buy one, and minus expenses, I'd be working some crappy McBurger Hut job for 18 months before I could afford even the cheapest of the models I was interested in. And that's when my uncle let me know about a logging company up near Lumbee that was looking for workers. I don't know what it's like these days, but it was easy to become a lumberjack back then, mainly because you'd have to be half crazy to want to do something so dangerous. To compensate, the pay was really generous, and since you didn't even need a high school diploma, it was a popular choice for guys who had the stones to do such a hazardous job. You gotta remember, this was the late 70s. There weren't all those safety regulations like you have today, where even the ass wipe has reflective safety strips on it.
True.
People got hurt back then. It was just a thing that happened, and when I first started as a lumberjack, there were guys who said that I wouldn't make it a month without picking up my first scar. I figured if I was careful, I could beat the odds and make it the 7 months that I needed to work to be able to afford a bike without getting myself hurt. I was right. And it turned out all that fear-mongering was just a way of screwing with the new guy, but another guy I signed on with, same age, the same sort of background, he lost his life out there in those woods. And to this day, I don't think the cops know who did it. So, just a few months after I started, this other kid my age signed on named McNally. The kid's first name was Adam, but everyone just called him by his surname, and we didn't really work together much, so I didn't know much about him as a person. But I heard stories, and they weren't good. Kid was quiet, kind of lazy, kind of weird, and he caused all kinds of problems for the crews that he worked with. He was always late, even when we were staying out at logging camps where he had literally no place else to be. He'd disappear for an hour at a time, and the guy started to think that he was off getting high or something. But since the crew chief couldn't ever find any drugs on him, all they could do was give him warnings until they had enough on him to fire him. And then one day, McNally just disappeared. The crew he was working with said that he just walked off into the woods, saying that he needed to take a leak.
Find me a good one.
That was the last they saw of him. We weren't at a logging camp at the time, so the other guys on this crew figured that he just quit and walked back into Lumbee without telling anyone. I mean, they didn't even really notice that he was missing until he had been gone for about 3 or 4 hours, and even then, they only did a quick look around the area before reporting back that McNally was gone. The next morning, he doesn't show up for work, so we figured that he's gone for good.
No.
And just carry on with our lives. And then a week or so later, and I only heard this secondhand, his mom showed up at the foreman's office. She was worried sick and hadn't heard from her son since the day he walked off the job, but rather than just call the cops, she spent the past few days driving around looking for him. That was another big reason we figured McNally was into something illegal. Why wouldn't his mom just call the cops right away, especially if she was so worried? The only reason
This one better? Is this the same voice?
to remain where I was.
Alright, let's see this one. Camping stories?
In the summer of 1981, one rural family found their home under siege by supernatural forces that none of them understood. Although researchers arrived on the property to help determine the nature of these disturbances, the events that unfolded on their farm were simply far too bizarre to categorize. And now, nearly 45 years later, we are no closer to answers. The only thing we can do is preserve their testimony as it was first presented, a story filled with monsters, mutilation, and strange lights seen in the woods. You won't want to miss this one. I mean, really, you won't want to miss this one.
Yeah. Won't want to miss this one.
Robert and his family lived on a quaint farm in the community of Rome, Ohio. And here, they had a pleasant life, raising poultry and minding their own business. But in 1981, things started to take a turn for the worse. The events that Robert and his family suffered through were recorded in Night Siege, an out-of-print book written by researcher and author Dennis Pilichis. For some reason, this terrifying story has gone mostly overlooked by people in the paranormal community, which is why I'm bringing it to you today. One thing to remember, though, the story of Robert's family unfolds over the entire summer of 1981, so I'm going to have to move fast and compress some things if we want to cover it all, but I promise it's worth it. Things began in early 1981. A deer was discovered on Robert's property, its sides slashed open as if by the claws of some gigantic unseen predator. It was the beginning of a mystery that, if still unsolved, would be at least reveal more hints as the year continued on. The next thing worth noting occurred in May of 1981. With Robert's permission, a group of Amish men arrived on his property to cut some wood, and they brought with them around 600 pounds of feed to sustain the horses that would help haul out the timber. But when they returned to the site the next day, the bags were shredded and emptied, just like the unfortunate deer that had been discovered. The Amish didn't know what to make of it, but continued operations, hauling more feed out to Robert's property. On that day, Robert heard gunfire from the woods, and when the Amish came out for the evening, he saw that one of their horses had a gaping wound on its side as well, but its owners wouldn't let on that anything unusual had happened. They simply said that they had been shooting at snakes, that's all. Still, the visitors to Robert's property kept working, that is, until one day when they suddenly stopped. Not only that, but they had abandoned all their equipment and didn't come back for it until over a month later. Please, like they didn't know something was going on. It was weird, to say the least. Now, going forward, you see, the winter before, Robert had installed a gas well on his property. But it wasn't until June that the gas line was installed in the woods. And as it turns out, a bulldozer operator on the property stumbled across something truly strange. A patch of land 40 feet wide, completely empty. And I mean completely. No vegetation, no rocks, nothing. The only thing there was to see were two pairs of holes, each about the size of a 50-gallon drum, bored into the ground. When Robert...
That's the worst thing about these stories, is that the people have the most bland voices. So you have to like find like people that actually make the shit interesting and fun to listen to. But that is so annoying to find.
Heard about this, he asked the driver of the bulldozer what he planned to do, and the man's response, "I didn't get paid to go around, I get paid to go through." Well, it was around this same time on June 15th that Robert started to notice animals on his farm disappearing. All in all, 4 ducks and a chicken had disappeared into the woods, but they didn't vanish without a trace. Their bodies were eventually recovered. In each case, the heads were torn off, their stomachs removed with one gigantic bite from some large animal. Robert quietly buried the birds, but as he did so, he also discovered something strange, much closer to the house. A large pile of sawdust that looked like something had been digging into it. The cherry on top of all of this is that before activity really took off on the property, there was an incident involving Robert's son. the 16-year-old had woken up in the middle of the night screaming in terror. He swore that he had awoken to find his face staring into his bedroom window. Everyone dismissed it as a nightmare, of course, but the entire family would soon come to share in this nightmare. Now, needless to say, things were odd on the farm at this point, and everyone realized it. But no one had any idea how strange they would get. Late on the night of June 25th, 1981, Robert and his sons were at home when they noticed a commotion among their ducks. There, in the front yard by the pine tree, they were shuffling around and flapping their wings, obviously agitated by something. And now, Robert is remembering everything that's happened until this point, and he knows that it all points to a big predator lurking somewhere on the property. And there, scuttling just beyond the beam of his flashlight, seems to be a shape. He can't make out any details other than the fact that it's massive. It's moving around on four legs and, most notably, has a pair of big, red, glowing eyes that are fixed on the flock of ducks. Well, immediately, he passes his flashlight to his son and takes aim. He scores a direct hit on the shape in the darkness using the eyes as a guide. Robert knows it was a direct hit because a blood-curdling shriek issued from this thing. That, and it took off running across the field at an incredible speed, too fast to get off a second shot. And even in the darkness, they could tell that it was enormous. But it hadn't run away on all fours. It stood up to run across the field on 2 feet, and clearly stood taller than any man, around 7 or 8 feet tall. Now, Robert and his boys stayed up most of the night. They weren't even worried about the ducks anymore. They were worried about themselves.
Worried about ducks. Not the ducks.
The next night, Robert couldn't sleep. So instead of tossing and turning, he had gone out to the living room to watch some TV. Around 2 in the morning, the family dog started barking outside. On a rural farm, this wasn't all that unusual. It had probably just caught sight of an animal that it wanted to catch. And so Robert turned down the volume on the TV set. As he did so, the barking stopped. Everything fell deathly quiet. And then the dog began whimpering and crying in terror. Robert immediately shot up from where he was sitting and scrambled to the back of the house, grabbing a flashlight on the way. He threw open the back door, passed the beam over the yard, and he saw his dog right away. It was trying to dig a hiding place underneath his push mower. And so Robert yells out to the dog, but it was no use. The animal was absolutely terrified. And this sinking feeling fell over Robert. He couldn't help but remember what happened the night before, and he swiveled the beam of his flashlight over the rest of the yard and then the wooden farm hoist he had constructed. And that was when he saw it. The large, shaggy shape was bigger than they had estimated. The top beams of the hoist were 12 feet tall, and the top of its head was no more than 3 feet lower than that. And it was covered head to toe in dark brown or black hair. It had a pair of these red eyes about the size of a baseball, and in the light of his flashlight, he could make out that the face he hadn't been able to see the night before. It looked like a cross between a person and a gorilla with this oversized, flattened nose. Below that, a thick-lipped mouth held a pair of shark-like fangs that protruded from its bottom jaw. Robert said that it was less than 30 feet away, making snorting and growling sounds, and he thought he was going to have a heart attack. And so after taking in as many details as he could bear, Robert scrambled back inside, yelling for his sons to get out of bed, get dressed, and get down there as quick as they could. And within moments, they were at his side, and Robert had grabbed a shotgun. Since they could hear this at the rear of the house, they snuck out the front door and piled in the pickup truck. Robert brought the vehicle around to the rear of the house, and there in the distance by the tree line, their headlights caught a glimpse of this thing. It skirted along the edge of the forest beside the road, so the family hit the highway, so to speak. But the chase didn't last very long. They made an effort to follow the thing as far as they could, but lost it. Passing the nearest neighbor's house half a mile down the road, they saw a car idling in the driveway. They asked their neighbor if they had seen anything, but if they had, the neighbor denied it. Robert and his sons decided they'd lost sight of the thing for good, so they headed back towards the house. Along the way, they kept their windows down and drove slow. They could still hear something out there among the thick trees, but never saw it again. And that was when the engine stopped running. No reason. The gas tank was full, the truck had been running fine moments earlier, and now it was dead as a doornail. Luckily, another neighbor passed by them and asked what they were doing in the middle of the road. And Robert admitted the crazy things they had been seeing on his property. The neighbor didn't seem very surprised. He admitted that his own sons now refused to camp in their backyard because they had seen what they heard or thought was a bear earlier in the summer. But now, everyone is wondering, was it really a bear? And now this entire time, Robert's trying to restart the truck. And then, just as suddenly as it had stopped, the truck coughed to life again. The whole family stayed up that night, waiting for this thing to come back. It never did. But their vigil gave them plenty of time to think about what had happened. Surely it was just a coincidence that they had seen the creature and then the truck had died, right? Right?
Sure.
And so 2 nights later, the events on the farm had everyone on edge to the point that they were afraid to leave the house at all. In fact, they had even canceled plans. Robert and his boys were musicians and had booked an opportunity to play music at a community gathering, but now nothing could convince anyone to leave the house. And for good reason, because this thing came back. And folks, it brought friends. By now, everyone is watching the tree line for any sign of movement. When it got really late, they started to perceive what seemed to be dark shapes lurking around the edge of the woods, near the field out back. Everyone was scared at first, and then they got mad. This was their house. The ducks and chickens were theirs too, and whatever this thing was, if it was left to do its business, it could ruin them. Robert and his boys, fully armed, marched outside. One of Robert's sons saddled up on the tractor, cranked it up, and headed out into the field, his family members pacing him, flashlights fixed on the trees. But the closer they got, the more they realized that they didn't need flashlights, because whatever it was in the woods had its own light. It was hard to see much, but everyone agreed that one of the dark shapes in the forest seemed to be waving a light back and forth. It looked like it was a dark blue. One of the family members tried to take aim, but the moment he raised his firearm, the light went out. And then, from deeper in the woods, the red eyes appeared. But not just one, multiple pairs, all staring back at them from between the tree trunks. And Robert and his sons have had it. Time to show these things they mean business. They just open fire with all their might, unloading their shotguns into the trees. When the dust settles, they've used up 2 full boxes of 12-gauge shells. So they all stand there, listening to the tractor idle and wondering where these intruders went. They start spinning around in circles, trying to get a bearing on their next course of action. And that's when somebody shouts, "There's something down by the pond." Everyone rushes to the side of the tractor. They train their flashlights in the direction of the pond and immediately catch one of the creatures by the water's edge. Without saying anything, someone opens fire. The thing tumbles into the murky water belly first, and the whole family just keeps on blasting. And while they're doing it, they notice that the other eyes in the forest have dropped low to the ground as if they're trying to hide. Finally, everyone stops to reload. But as they do, one of those sets of eyes darts out from the forest, scuttles to the edge of the pond, and jumps in the water. They can't see much, but there's a commotion. When they finally train their lights back on the water, it's sloshing violently, but the body of these things is nowhere to be seen. That's when Robert and his boys realize something. They're almost out of ammo. They're far from the house, and whatever these things are, they don't seem bothered by shotguns. Everyone beats it back to the house as fast as their legs will carry them. They cower inside all night, just catching glimpses of things in the distance. Luckily, Nothing seems to bother them. Another night has passed with everyone alive. It's around this time that Dennis Pilichis enters the picture. He arrives at the farm and immediately starts looking for footprints, and he soon finds them, but as you can see from this picture, they're absolutely bizarre. Round impressions with only 3 toes apiece, spread about 6 feet apart. Stranger still, the trackways would continue for a time and then disappear, only to pick up again a while later. Dennis starts asking the family more questions. It seems as if whatever was holding the blue light was different than the other things with the red eyes. And not only that, but in addition to the light it held, these other figures seemed to have a soft white glow barely outlining their bodies. Over the coming days, Dennis and his fellow researchers would see this firsthand. This is part of what makes Night Siege so fascinating. It isn't just a story handed down over the years. Dennis and several outside observers were on site for some of it and saw some of this stuff firsthand. That doesn't happen very often in stories like this. Dennis wrote this.
Even though a complete mystery, almost everyone has seen these events, sometimes confirming events as they happen from different locations. This confirms something is being seen that has some sort of dimension to it and not merely some sort of reflection. These strange light sources and mysterious black forms are a common thread among many UFO and creature encounters. One night, 3 members of the research team saw the backwoods light up as bright as day. The glow was a pure and clear white color. The woods grew bright 3 times in a 5-minute period.
There's also a paper trail from law enforcement testifying to the experiences of Robert and his sons. On June 29th, the family brought in police officers in addition to Dennis's team. They filed 2 police reports, which they categorized as suspicious activity. 2 days later, the family had settled into a new nighttime routine. They would climb onto their roof, firearms in hand, and wait for the intruders to arrive. The night of July 1st was no different in that regard, although the phenomenon put in quite a show that night, and it got even weirder. While keeping watch, 2 family members noticed something hovering over the trees. They described 4 objects or lights, all spaced evenly above the treetops. They changed colors from red to blue to yellow, and then, oddly enough, something that seemed more like black. Each one was enormous, about the size of a basketball if you held it at arm's length, although they were shaped more like boxes than spheres. On one occasion, one of these objects shot down a white beam of light somewhere inside the tree line, making the interior of the forest as bright as day. Everyone watched, mouths open, as the bizarre sight lit up the entirety of the woods. But any awe they felt was immediately replaced by terror, because somewhere out there in the woods, a sound welled up. But it wasn't a calm, eerie moan or a long, protracted howl. It was manic. It was what sounded like a woman in distress screaming from somewhere deeper in the forest. And then, without warning, the lights above the trees blinked out. The sudden shift from brightness to absolute darkness left everyone unable to see for a moment or two. And when their eyes recovered, they spotted what seemed to be more of these shadowy figures running just inside the forest, clear enough to see, but well out of the effective range of their shotguns. All the family members could do was watch and stare. It got to be too much, so the watchmen on the roof went back inside and retrieved their rifles. Once back up top, the family started taking pot shots at the intruders, but after a while, they started to get a sinking feeling. None of these shapes had any glowing eyes. Those stayed inside the forest. These other shadow figures, on the other hand, would dart into the field. Each time a hit was scored on one of these shapes, it would scream, but the red eyes never moved. They seemed to be watching, waiting from just beyond the trees. Were the shapes in the field nothing more than a distraction? Is this story weird enough for you? Because it's about to get weirder. Dennis wrote this.
While up on the roof, later, they noticed two forms with red glowing eyes come up the side of the field and stand to the side of the barn. They tried to talk to them from up on the roof, waited 5 minutes, and then lowered the boom on them. They screamed, yelled, and ran off. At one point during the night, while taking turns shooting at these forms as they ran around on the woodline, they looked out again and saw their horse standing there out in the field. At this time, their horse was locked up in the barn, did not get out, and was not out in that field. But the form looked like his horse. They knew something was wrong and that even though it was their horse out there, it was not their horse.
It wasn't their horse.
Realizing that this was yet another distraction, the family unloaded on the phantom horse, which was well within range. As with the other shadow figures, the shape screamed, this time running off to the northeast part of the field. A quick inspection of the field shortly thereafter revealed that their hunch had proven correct. There was no blood anywhere to be found, just a few indistinct points in the ground. Their horse was locked up tight. It had been some sort of bizarre decoy perpetrated by whatever had invaded the farm. So everyone heads back up to the roof. They stay there until around 3:30 in the morning, when another light appears above a cornfield across the street. It shot a beam of light that one of the boys said hit him in the head, causing him to lose his balance and almost tumble off the roof. The other responded by opening fire on the light, which instantly extinguished. The boy hit with the light blacked out for a moment, but thankfully regained consciousness, even if he was left with a headache that stretched into the following day. And then, about an hour after this, something like a red-hot coal, but bigger in size, drifted down from the sky and landed among the branches of a nearby tree to the east, directly across the street from the cornfield above which the light had appeared earlier. Now again, the family isn't taking any prisoners at this point. They take a few shots at the light. Ready for more? Here's what Dennis wrote.
It jumped down a branch and turned into a small animal-like creature, something like an owl. They continued to shoot at it. It continued to jump down a branch until it fell out of the tree onto the ground. At this point, the thing got up and ran down the woodline on all fours. The family ran over to the tree, which was almost directly on the woodline, and saw a depression in the soft field grass where it looked like something heavy had fallen out of the tree onto the ground, leaving an obvious impression.
Now, this is just getting weird, right? This is crazy. This is all in addition to a cigar box-shaped object that seemed to silently fly by at one point, complete with red and blue lights. Robert was the one to take aim at it this time, and his shot was followed by the sound of breaking glass. The object then reappeared later over the trees. More shadow figures appeared throughout the night. Hey, I told you there was a lot to cover today. We ain't over yet. Now, it might be easy to think that this is all just a tall tale, but remember, Dennis Pilichis visited the property regularly during this period and even saw some of these things himself. The events were also accompanied by physical evidence, like the footprints. The events of July 1st yielded additional tracks from which casts were made. What's more, eyewitnesses around Rome, Ohio were having their own sightings during this time period, although none of them were half as dramatic as what Robert and his family experienced. The encounters continued though, nothing quite like the first night in July. Off and on, family members, including Robert, would see these large, dark shapes outside that would dart away from the house as soon as they were spotted. Robert eventually put up barbed wire around the front yard, hoping that might keep these things at bay. Now, some of the weirdest evidence that Dennis collected were not just the 3-toed footprints, but regular 5-toed footprints surrounded by something odd.
The strange thing about this find was that the field grass was swirled around the footprint impressions in a
and around 7 or 8 feet tall.
Oh no, I fucked up.
Everyone was scared at first, and then they got mad. This was their house. The ducks and chickens were theirs too. Shape screamed, this time running off to the northeast part. Been some sort of bizarre decoy perpetrated by whatever field above which the light had appeared earlier. Now again, the family isn't taking any prisoners at this point. They take a cigar box-shaped object by physical evidence, large, dark shapes outside that would dart away from the house as soon as they were spotted. Robert eventually put up barbed wire around the front yard, hoping that might keep these things at bay. Now, some of the weirdest evidence that Dennis collected were not just the 3-toed footprints, but regular 5-toed footprints surrounded by something odd.
The strange thing about this find was that the field grass was swirled around the footprint impressions in a clockwise direction. It was one of the strangest things I had ever seen. We found 5 prints which exhibited these swirl effect around each print. The prints were spaced 6 feet apart. When the tractor path prints veered off into the clearing and field, they left a normal broken path, which did not have the mysterious swirl effect.
Dennis Piliches and area researchers had what they described as an intense experience while on Robert's property on July 6th. They said that a glowing form clearly stepped out of the forest on the opposite side of the field. Members of the family opened fire like they always did, dropping the shape into the tall grass. Dennis and the other investigators rushed to where the figure had fallen, but it took a little longer than they would have liked because they had to hop on an electrical fence. And when they reached the area, they saw clear signs that something had indeed been brought down there. There was a large impression in the grass and another path heading away from the site, as if something had dragged itself along the ground, but predictably, no body. Dennis and another researcher began pelting the forest with rocks, trying to elicit a response. It didn't take long for another rock to come whizzing out of the trees, flying past their heads and landing at the feet of the family 15 feet behind them. Around this time, those familiar glowing red lights started popping up all through the forest to the east of the house, prompting everyone to retreat back inside. For the rest of the night, they saw figures outlined in a dim glow, as well as those red eyes playing hide and seek off in the distance. Their height off the ground varied from just a few feet to 12 feet in the air. Then, around 3 a.m. on the morning of July 7th, Dennis saw something that truly impressed him. He said this:
"The best sighting we all had this night was when 3 sets of big, red glowing eyes were observed. One to the left, one behind the dead tree, and one lower, almost on the ground. The bigger creature was over 12 feet tall, judging from the dead tree trunk, and stepped out and stood to the left of the tree. My flashlight beam was right on it at this time, and the body of the creature actually casting a shadow on the big dead tree trunk. Black hair could be seen shining in the light of the flashlight from the creature's body. Everyone fired at it. All the critter did was turn sideways with a strange sort of motion and moved out of the flashlight beam. The shooting did not appear to have any sort of effect at all. After the bigger creature moved away, I had the flashlight beam directly on the red glowing-eyed face of the one to the right that was almost on the ground for almost a full minute or two. I will never forget this experience. I actually then saw it sort of crawl away, moving back into the woods."
Fuck that.
Dennis noted that no matter how much firepower the family used, the eyes didn't really seem to care. It was only the shadow figures that reacted, and even they seemed to be putting on a theatrical production more than actually getting hurt by anything. Things started to taper off a little bit by August. There were still plenty of sightings, but everything seemed to get as normal as it got nowadays. Another chicken died, this time found among a bunch of scattered building materials with a chunk bitten out of its backside. More phantom flashlight beams shot out of the woods, sometimes white, sometimes blue, sometimes accompanied by the same shadowy forms that had become so familiar. Strange smells would drift over the property, sending pets like farm cats into a panic. There's a chilling reference towards the end of Night Siege. Dennis says that Robert admitted that there was some sort of linkage between one of his sons, these beings, and the UFOs. It isn't discussed much more than a passing reference to what seems like poltergeist activity in their home, and a series of finger-like impressions were discovered on a battered fuse box in the basement, like something with tremendous strength had tried to sabotage the family's electricity. Interestingly, a control panel that monitored Robert's gas pipeline was also found smashed in on 3 separate occasions. Other than that, exactly what link existed between Robert's son and the phenomena remains a mystery. There was one last experiment that Dennis, Robert, and the researchers conducted on the farm, and they decided to set a trap. Dennis wrote that it was fellow researcher Willard McIntyre's idea. Dennis said this.
In his letter, he suggested we try different lures and could try to get these creatures on film. He said he could bring tape recordings of ducks and of a rabbit screaming. Plus, he could bring 3 live rabbits that we would be staked out in some appropriate location, hoping the creatures would run out and try to get the rabbits. Inside the rabbits would be capsules of cyanide. These capsules could only be broken if the rabbit is eaten alive. We came back to Robert's property around 8 p.m. Willard and Larry got the rabbits ready. They were staked out in an open field, which we had Robert plow beforehand. The rabbits were tied with 1,200-pound test parachute cord, one end around a back foot and the other to a metal milk crate. A tape loop of rabbits screaming was prepped and used to try and attract these creatures.
Dennis said that around 9:30 that night, he and 4 others observing the trap from different angles spotted the red eyes in the woods, as many as 6 separate pairs at a time, as if they were ready to make a dash for the rabbits. But nothing ever happened. Everyone eventually went to bed. The next day, Dennis and Willard arrived on the property. No one had gone out to check the rabbits. When they arrived at the site of the trap, no one could believe their eyes. 1 rabbit had been taken. Another was gone as well. The milk crate it had been tethered to was found resting on its side. And the 1,200-pound parachute cord, it wasn't untied. It was snapped in 2 like it had been exploded out, something no human being could do. And sets of 5-toed footprints were found all around, mashed deep into the soil. And that's where the story ends, at least publicly. Dennis alludes to the fact that the story is ongoing, but we don't know much more beyond that. Now recently, rumors have started circulating that Dennis's old tapes have resurfaced, offering hope that we might someday learn more about this case, which has to be one of the most dramatic encounters ever recorded. But until someone shares those with the public, we're all left wondering what exactly happened in Rome, Ohio in the summer of 1981. If it is authentic, and there's no reason to doubt it is, other than how intense the whole thing was, then the case chronicled in Dennis Pilich's Night Siege has the potential to completely reshape not only what we think we know about UFOs and Bigfoot, but also reality itself. And because you guys made it this far into the video, I want you to all comment below, "It's coming right for us!" So that way I know who made it to the end of the video and who didn't. And if you guys enjoy storytelling like this, where we dive into strange cases of the mysterious and supernatural, then what are you waiting for? Smack that like and subscribe button right now for more content just like this. As always, never forget, I love you all, keep an open mind, and I'll see you all in the very next video.
At least this guy was, like, entertaining.
Things that we had been taught.
He doesn't have that, like, boring voice. Kind of like my voice. Super boring. Ooh.
When you think of North Carolina, what comes to mind? The stunning Blue Ridge Mountains, The pristine Outer Banks, Mr. Beast's home state? But what if I told you that beneath the surface, in the dark woods and secluded corners of this state, lurks things that only exist in your nightmares? People have been reporting strange, unexplained phenomena in the North Carolina wilderness for decades. Encounters of beings and crafts that defy explanation. Sightings of things that simply should not exist. These aren't just campfire tales or urban legends anymore. In today's video, I will share 4 first-hand accounts from hunters who ventured into the woods and came back with experiences that would change them forever. These are the reasons why North Carolina is actually terrifying.
Yo, North Carolina.
On January 8th, 2007, Chris Bledsoe set out on what was supposed to be a regular hunting trip with his 17-year-old son and 3 buddies, Donnie Ackerman, David McDonald, and a guy named Gene. They headed towards their favorite spot near the Cape Fear River Wilderness in North Carolina. Now, this place is pretty isolated and off the beaten path. It's the spot you go to get away from it all. So they get settled in for the night, set up a fire by the river, and just relax, shooting the breeze. On this night, it's so beautiful and peaceful. After relaxing for a little while, Chris decides to walk along a nearby trail, stretch his legs, and just take in the nighttime air. So he tells the guys what he's gonna do and that he'll be back in a few. As he walked, he suddenly heard this strange ringing sound coming from both sides of the trail. Initially, he's not sure. He thinks it could be some deer or other wildlife rustling around in the underbrush, but something about the sound just doesn't sit right with him. It's too coordinated and too purposeful to be a random animal. Chris is a very experienced outdoorsman, like I'm sure many people watching this. He's spent enough time in the woods to know the usual sounds of nature and critters, but this sound is so off, it's unnerving to say the least. So, out of reaction, he quickened his pace because he was unsure what he was dealing with. The entire time, he starts to get this feeling in his gut that something is wrong. Folks, don't ignore your gut instinct. It's usually right. And the more he walks in this direction, the stronger the feeling. Eventually, he finds himself in this large field near the main road. He still feels it in the pit of his gut, but he doesn't see anything or any reason for this alarm. He stopped momentarily to take a breather, looking around and scanning his surroundings. As he's scanning, his eyes catch something that's out of place. In fact, it's not just out of place, it shouldn't be there at all. 3 large orange spheres are hovering just above the tree line, less than a mile from where he's standing, and they're moving downward, slowly, deliberately, until they stop. He is absolutely transfixed by what he's seeing. He can't believe his eyes. And these spheres were not like anything he'd ever seen before. They're not aircraft, they're not helicopters, they're not anything that he can explain, and they're just hovering there, silently, ominously. It's like they were watching him or studying him. Now, despite every instinct telling him to run, to get as far away from these things as possible, he just finds himself rooted to the spot. He's mesmerized, unable to look away, and he watches them for quite a while as they hover there in the air for a total of 10 minutes or so. He wasn't just standing there watching this, he was almost in like this trance state. It was very bizarre. After some time, he feels like he has snapped out of it and realizes the gravity of the situation. He needs to get back to the others, warn them before it gets worse. So he turns and starts running back towards the campsite, and his heart is beating out of his chest. He's running, his mind is racing. What were those things? Where do they come from? Of course, he has no answers. And at this point, he's out of breath and very visibly shaken when he finally reaches the campsite. And the other guys can immediately tell something's wrong. They're all like, "Chris, what happened? What's going on?" But before he can even get a word out, he realizes his son is nowhere to be seen. And so panic sets in as he starts frantically calling out for him, running into the woods, desperately searching for any sign of him. This is a father's worst nightmare. His son is missing, and he just saw something he can't explain, something that shouldn't be there. The other guys join in the search, calling out his son's name and combing through the underbrush. And then, just as suddenly as he disappeared, Chris's son stumbles out of the woods. He's pale, he's shaking, and with a look of pure terror on his face. So Chris runs over, grabs him by the shoulders, and says, "What happened? Where were you?" Now his son was barely able to speak, and all he mutters is, I saw something in the woods. It wasn't human, it wasn't an animal, it was something else." Now Chris's blood chills, because he knows deep down that whatever his son saw, it's somehow connected to those spheres, those things in the sky. But before he can press his son for more details, the other guys start shouting, pointing up at the sky. Now Chris looks up and sees something that makes his jaw drop, because there in the night sky are 6 to 8 bright lights. At first they look like stars, but then they start moving, and they're flying in from different parts of the sky, converging on each other like they're being pulled by some invisible force. And then, right before their eyes, 3 of the lights line up side by side and start flying in formation. And they're heading straight for them, getting closer and closer. All the men are frozen now, unable to move or breathe, and the lights are so bright and so blinding that they have to shield their eyes. And then, just as quickly as they appeared, the lights flew over their heads and vanished behind the tree line on the other side of the river. And at that moment, Chris knows they need to get out of there, because whatever those things are, whatever they want, it can't be good. He starts shouting at the other men, telling them to grab their gear and leave now. But they're all in shock, trying to process. Chris has to practically drag them to their feet, shoving their gear into their hands. They leave everything else behind. The fire is still crackling. Nobody better tell Smokey the Bear. The tents are still up. None of that matters anymore. All that matters is getting away from this place and getting to safety. They all pile in Chris's truck, and he's flooring it, the tires spinning on the dirt road, and they're all just silent, lost in their thoughts, trying to make sense of everything. And just when they think it can't get any worse, when they think they might be in the clear, Chris suddenly slams on the brakes, the truck skidding to a halt. There, just above the road, is another object. But this one is different. It's not a sphere, it's egg-shaped and brilliant white, with a long tail and spikes jutting from the middle. It's like nothing they've ever seen, like from some sort of science fiction movie. The object is about 200 yards ahead, hovering silently above the road, maybe 20 feet or so. They could see this spiked section slowly rotating like it's scanning the area. The men are truly terrified now. This is happening too close, it's too real. They don't know if they've been seen or if they're in danger, and so they're just stuck watching this thing, daring to breathe, and suddenly it starts to rise up, and it moves up slowly, almost gracefully, before suddenly shooting off over the trees and out of sight.
Everyone would have been all quiet.
The men
I
are
would have
left
farted,
just staring at the
100%.
empty road at the spot where the
nervous fart.
object had just been. It's like it was never there at all. Now Chris doesn't wait around. He hits the gas and they speed off down the road. He's not taking any chances. He needs to get these men home, to get his son home. And as he's driving, he looks over at his son. The boy is pale, shaking, staring out the window like he's expecting the object to reappear at any moment. And so Chris just reaches over and puts a hand on his shoulder and tries to reassure him. But how do you reassure someone after something like that? How do you tell them it's going to be okay when you're unsure?
No.
Chris drops each of the men off at their homes, and they all live in the same general area, so it doesn't take long. But each stop is tense, each goodbye is rushed. They all just want to be inside, lock their doors, and try to forget this ever happened. Chris and his son arrive home at their own
Being inside
property,
is such a false
and
sense of
they live on
security.
a sprawling 6 acres of land that usually feels like a sanctuary. But tonight, the darkness feels threatening. And now, they've only been home for about 4 hours when they hear a sound that terrifies them. It's like a jet engine, but much closer and right above the house. So Chris runs outside, looking up at the sky, but doesn't see anything. The sound fades away, and then just 30 to 45 minutes later, the dogs in the kennel start barking frantically. And it's not their usual bark, it's this panicked, fearful sound like they're facing down something terrifying. Chris's retriever is barking, staring intently towards the kennels, and Chris knows he can't ignore this, he has to check it out. And his son is scared, begging him not to go, but Chris knows he has no choice. He convinces his son to come with him, thinking it might be safer to stick together. And when they open the door, the retriever takes off like a shot, running behind the kennels. Chris and his son follow, the barking getting louder and more frantic with each step. Around the corner, they see the dog standing there, hackles raised, barking at something in the bushes. Chris squints into the darkness, trying to see what has got the dog so riled up. But he just can't see anything. It's just shadows and vague shapes in the night. Now suddenly, the dog takes off again, but this time chasing something. Chris and his son run after her down the road that leads to the kennels, into the backyard, and all the way to the very rear of the property. They're trying to cut off whatever the dog is chasing to corner it. When they reach the blueberry hedgerow at the back of the property, the dog abruptly stops. She's barking like crazy, a high-pitched sound, panicked. And that's when Chris sees it. Just a few feet away, there is something unlike anything he's ever seen. It's about 4 feet tall, unlike any animal he's ever encountered. It seems encased in a clear glass-like covering that gives off a faint red glow. He can't make out its face, but it appears to be wearing goggles and a dark mask. Now he's frozen in shock, staring at this being, and his mind is just trying to process this. Is it a kind of alien, a government experiment? He has no idea. All he knows is that it is not of this world. The dog is still barking, inching closer to the thing, and Chris's son is right behind him, also staring in disbelief. And then this thing vanishes. It doesn't run away, it doesn't fade away, it's just gone like it was never there. Chris blinks and shakes his head, wondering if he's losing his mind, but then his son speaks with a trembling voice and tells his dad, "That's what I saw in the woods, at the campsite. It was the same thing." As you can imagine, Chris is overcome with complete dread. This wasn't a one-off encounter. These beings, whatever they are, seem to be following them, watching them. He ushers his son back to the house, the dog following closely behind, and once they're inside, he double-checks all the locks, peers out the windows into the dark. He doesn't know what to do or who to call. Who would believe him? The police? The media? He'd sound crazy. Now, in the following days, Chris couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. Every shadow seemed to hold a threat, and every unusual sound made him jump. He was constantly on edge, always looking over his shoulder. His son would have nightmares, waking up screaming in the middle of the night. They were both struggling to just process this. But what did it all mean? Were they being invaded, studied, abducted? Chris didn't know. All he knew was that his life had changed forever that night in the woods, and he couldn't unsee what he had seen. Well, it wasn't long before he started doing research and looked into UFO sightings and other alien-related things, and he was surprised to find out how many people had experienced similar things. There were reports from all over the world dating back decades. People who had seen strange lights in the sky, encountering bizarre creatures, and even claimed to have been abducted. It was a rabbit hole that Chris found himself falling deeper into, having experienced it himself. But the more he learned, the more questions he had. And folks, he believes that he was marked that day because he would have an incredibly bizarre experience just a few years later that he couldn't explain. Early in the morning of April 8th, 2012, just outside of Fayetteville, North Carolina, one of the strangest stories I've ever heard was about to unfold